Why so many human species vanished, except us based on real paleoanthropology and written in a calm story style for listening. 1. When the Earth had many humans, there was a time when the Earth did not belong to one kind of human. If you could stand on a cold hill at dusk, long before cities, long before writing, long before the first names we still remember, and if you could look down into the valleys of Africa, Europe, and Asia, you would not see a single human story moving in one straight line. You would see many stories at once. In one region, tall hunters with long legs and patient faces would move across open land. In another, broad-chested people would follow herds under a hard winter sky. On an island, small, clever humans would live among strange animals. In a cave, a fire would burn before hands that were not quite like ours, and yet close enough that in low light you might mistake them for family. This is one of the strangest truths in all of history. For most of human time, we were not alone. Today, we use the word human as if it has always meant us and only us. But the deeper story is quieter and more unsettling. For a very long time, the world held several kinds of humans. Some were old and established, shaped by climates and landscapes we would find difficult. Some were experimental branches of the same restless family. Some were close enough to us that children could be born between us. Some were so recent that, measured against the age of the planet, they vanished only a moment ago. And now only one remains. That is the mystery we are entering tonight. Why did so many human species vanish while Homo sapiens, our own species, stayed? The easy answer would be to say that we were simply better, smarter, stronger, more advanced. But easy answers often flatten the truth. History, especially deep history, does not usually work like a contest with one obvious winner and a crowd of obvious losers. It is messier than that, more intimate, more accidental, sometimes more sad, because many of those vanished humans were not failures. Some lasted far longer than our own species has existed so far. Some mastered difficult worlds for hundreds of thousands of years. Some survived cold, hunger, thin mountain air, island scarcity, and wild swings in weather. Some cared for injured members. Some made tools with patience. Some almost certainly told stories, though the sound of those stories is gone. If we listen carefully, the evidence we have left does not tell a tale of simple conquest. It tells a tale of overlapping lives, narrow survival, changing climate, small populations, migration, mixing, chance, and pressure that built slowly over thousands of years. Imagine a giant family gathering stretched across continents and ages. Cousins living far apart begin to meet again after long separation. Some trade places. Some compete for food. Some avoid one another. Some fall in love. Some disappear not in a single disaster, but in a long, fading village by village, valley by valley, generation by generation. No trumpet sounds. No one announces the end. One campfire goes dark, then another, and one branch of the family keeps walking. That branch was us. But even that is not the full story because the others did not vanish cleanly. They left marks in our bones, in our tools, in our genes, and maybe even in the ways we imagine what it means to be human. In that sense, the last surviving human species is not entirely pure or alone. We are partly a gathering place, a final room where pieces of older rooms still remain. So tonight, instead of treating the past like a ladder with us standing proudly on top, we will treat it like an old forest path. We will walk slowly. We will meet the tall travelers of the early world, the cave dwellers of Ice Age Europe, the hidden mountain cousins known mostly from fragments and DNA, the island people who lived small but skillful lives, and the strange populations that remind us evolution is not neat. We will also ask a harder question. Maybe the real mystery is not why they vanished. Maybe the real mystery is how close we came to vanishing too, because our species was never guaranteed. At several points our ancestors were few in number. Climate changed, landscapes dried, prey shifted, rivals lived nearby. One more bad turn, one more longer drought, one more broken migration route, and perhaps it would be some other human cousin asking why Homo sapiens disappeared. But that did not happen. Instead, here we are in electric light, trying to understand a vanished crowd from broken teeth, cave dust, stone blades, and ancient strands of DNA. That kind of knowledge is both powerful and humble. Powerful because it lets us recover a world that seemed lost forever. Humble because each new discovery tends to make the old story less simple, not more. The deeper we look, the stranger the human story becomes. And so we begin not with kings or wars, but with footprints, with ash, with a hand shape in stone, with a valley at dusk when more than one kind of person is alive under the same sky. For a while, the earth was crowded with humans. Then it was not. 2. The long rule of Homo erectus long before our own species spread across the world. There was another traveler who deserves more respect than it usually gets. Homo erectus. The name can sound dry in a textbook, but the life behind it was anything but dry. If you want to understand why extinction is not the same thing as weakness, begin here. Homo erectus may have been one of the greatest long-distance survivors in the whole human story. This species appeared roughly 2 million years ago in Africa and lasted, in some places, for an astonishing stretch of time. Depending on how fossils are grouped, Homo erectus or very close relatives endured for well over 1 million years. That is not a short experiment. That is an empire of time. Picture an evening camp on open land. The air cools quickly after sunset. Bodies gather close to warmth. Stone tools lie nearby, shaped not beautifully for display but effectively for use. Meat may be roasting. Someone watches the dark edge of the grassland. Someone else checks the fire. Children doze. Adults listen. This is not modern life, but it is not chaos either. There is order here, memory, skill, habit. Homo erectus had a body that in many ways would not shock us from a distance. Long legs, upright stride, a body built for movement across ground. Earlier human relatives had already walked on 2 legs, but Homo erectus seems to have done so with a new level of efficiency. This mattered. In an ancient world, distance was survival. To reach water, follow herds, escape drying land, or enter fresh territory, a body that could keep going was a great advantage. And go they did. Homo erectus was among the first human species to leave Africa. That movement changed everything. It meant that the human story was no longer tied to one continent alone. It entered new climates, new plants, new predators, new rhythms of season. Evidence linked to Homo erectus or closely related populations appears across a vast range, from Africa into Eurasia. They were not sitting still, waiting for the future to arrive. They were making the human map larger. This matters because survival is often mistaken for innovation of the flashy kind. We praise art, symbols, and later technologies, and those things do matter. But another kind of intelligence is quieter. It is the intelligence of repeated endurance, the intelligence of doing enough reliably for a very long time, the intelligence of building a life that works. Homo erectus seems to have possessed exactly that. They used tools. They likely managed fire in at least some contexts, though scholars still debate details at specific sites. They hunted or scavenged large animals. They adapted to different environments. Recent evidence keeps adding nuance to the picture, suggesting that these people could live in places harsher than older researchers once assumed. The more we learn, the less fair it seems to imagine them as clumsy half-people fumbling toward us. In a way, Homo erectus poses a challenge to our pride. If our species likes to think of itself as destiny, Homo erectus reminds us that being human did not always mean being us. Another form of humanity once did remarkably well for a remarkably long time. So why are they gone? Not because they were stupid, not because they failed immediately, not because nature rejected them. The real answer is probably much less dramatic and much more ancient. Over very long periods, climates shifted, populations separated, local groups adapted in different ways. Some branches of Homo erectus may have given rise to later humans. Others may have simply thinned out region by region as newer populations spread, environments changed, and small communities lost resilience. That is one of the quiet rules of deep time. A species does not need one grand ending. It can have many small endings. A river changes course. A drought lasts longer than expected. A hunting range shrinks. A group becomes isolated. Another group arrives with slightly better tools, slightly wider exchange networks, or slightly better luck in raising children. Nothing dramatic happens in 1 year, but over centuries, then millennia, the balance shifts. We often ask why species vanish as if extinction must have a single cause. For animals and humans alike, it is often a braid of causes: climate pressure, habitat change, competition, isolation, demography, bad luck. One strand alone may not break a population. Twisted together, they do. Imagine the last small communities descended from Homo erectus. No one in those communities would know they were near the end. There would be no title card, no music, no voice from the sky saying your branch of the human family has only a few generations left. They would wake, search, rest, raise children, repair tools, and watch seasons pass exactly as their ancestors had done. Then somewhere there would be 1 year with fewer children, 1 year with harder travel, 1 year with less game, 1 year when a neighboring group did not return, and still life would go on. That is how extinction often looks from the inside. It does not feel like a dramatic ending. It feels like life becoming narrower. By the time our own species appears much later in the story, Homo erectus is already a reminder of something important. Human survival was never about one perfect design. Different kinds of humans could be successful in different ways. The world did not reward only one style of being human. It tolerated variety for a long time. That is why the later disappearance of so many human species feels so haunting. A large family once existed. The fact that one powerful old branch like Homo erectus could thrive for so long and still disappear tells us that endurance alone is not forever. No matter how successful a species once was, changing conditions can slowly turn old strengths into partial advantages, then into insufficient ones. Homo erectus teaches the first lesson of tonight's mystery. Vanishing is not proof that a people never belonged here. Sometimes it means they belonged here for a very long time, until the world itself changed around them. 3. A family tree like a bush if you were taught human evolution as a clean line, something like ape, then primitive human, then better human, then finally us. It is worth pausing and letting that image dissolve. The real picture is more like a bush or a delta or a set of paths crossing in dust. Branches split. Some continue. Some stop. Some may rejoin through mixing. Some exist alongside each other for enormous stretches of time. And some leave behind so little evidence that we only glimpse them when a few bones or a few teeth appear from darkness. This is part of why the question feels so mysterious. It is not only that other human species vanished, it is that there were so many more varieties of humanity than earlier generations realized. There were species such as Homo habilis, associated with early tool use. There were forms often grouped under Homo heidelbergensis, or related populations, important because many researchers see them as close to the shared roots of later lineages, including Neanderthals and perhaps our own species in part. There was Homo naledi in southern Africa, whose mix of features seemed at once old and oddly late in time, as if evolution had folded a page and hidden part of the script from us. There were species like Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis on islands, reminding us that isolation can produce bodies and ways of life very different from the mainland story. Each discovery has a slightly unsettling effect. It forces us to admit that being human was once a broader category than we instinctively feel. Imagine a world map lit up not by countries but by human forms. East Africa holds one population, Europe another. Siberia and wider Asia hold others. Islands preserve strange local survivors. In one place, tall bodies cross open land. In another, stockier bodies hold heat against winter. Somewhere else, smaller humans navigate limited island resources. In caves, on plains, in forests, on coasts, humanity is experimenting. No committee planned this. Evolution rarely aims. It wanders and selection edits. One reason so many branches existed is that populations were often separated by geography for very long periods. Mountains, deserts, forests, changing coastlines, and glacial barriers all shaped movement. Once a population is separated, it begins to drift genetically and adapt locally. Over enough time, differences deepen. Sometimes they remain shallow enough for later interbreeding. Sometimes they become large enough that a separate species or near species emerges. This means that diversity in the human family was not a mistake. It was the natural result of long time, large landscapes, and repeated separation. We should also resist the temptation to think of every extinct human species as a fully distinct creature in the tidy way that zoo labels suggest. Paleoanthropology is full of debate. Scientists argue over whether some fossils represent separate species, regional variants, or parts of one wider population. This does not weaken the mystery. It strengthens it. It means the edges were fuzzy. Human diversity was not arranged in neat boxes. It blurred, shifted, overlapped. And that blur matters when we ask why only one human species is alive today. Because perhaps the last stage was not simply one species killing off several others in a clean sweep. Perhaps it was a long process in which some groups were replaced, some absorbed, some reduced to isolated pockets, and some lost to environmental change before our species even met them. Think of language accents spreading across a continent, then becoming separate languages after centuries of distance. Now imagine that process working not only in speech, but in bodies, behavior, immunity, metabolism, and adaptation to climate. Imagine groups diverging slowly, meeting again, diverging again, surviving in fragments. That is closer to the mood of deep human history. There is also another humbling detail. The fossil record is incomplete. Entire populations may have existed and vanished without leaving us enough evidence to name them. Bones preserve only in rare conditions. Many landscapes erase their dead. Many caves remain unexcavated. Many coastlines where people once lived are now underwater. We are likely seeing only part of the old crowd. So when we say that many human species vanished, the number itself may be an understatement. There may have been more cousins than we know. This makes the modern world feel stranger. We walk through cities assuming the definition of human is settled. But in the long view, our present condition is unusual. A single surviving human species spread nearly everywhere, speaking thousands of languages, but belonging to one biological kind. For most of our past, that was not the case. To understand the disappearance of the others, we first need to feel how normal plurality once was. A lonely modern certainty replaces an older prehistoric variety, and maybe that is why these vanished relatives attract such deep fascination. They are not just extinct animals. They are alternate versions of us. Not monsters, not myths, not side characters, but fellow humans shaped by different pressures. If one or two accidents had shifted, Perhaps one of those other forms would have lasted into recorded history. Perhaps ancient traders would have described meetings not only between distant peoples, but between different humans. Imagine Roman travelers hearing rumors of mountain valleys where another humankind lived. Imagine medieval maps placing not dragons at the edges, but a surviving cousin species adapted to forests or ice. Imagine not total human sameness, but human plurality continuing into the age of writing. That did not happen. By the time history begins to speak clearly in written words, almost all the other branches are gone or already folded into us. The bush has thinned, the paths have narrowed, and yet traces remain enough to tell us that the human story was once a gathering, not a solo performance. This is the second lesson of tonight's mystery. The disappearance of other human species feels profound because they were not rare side notes to our rise. They were part of the main story. For a long time, being human meant being one among many. 4. The Neanderthal winter of all our vanished relatives. The Neanderthals are the ones who stayed closest to the public imagination. That is partly because their bones are relatively well known, partly because they lived recently enough to feel near us, and partly because older myths about them were so wrong that correcting those myths has become a story of its own. For years, popular culture treated Neanderthals as crude cave brutes. Heavy brows, low intelligence, blunt force, no subtlety. A kind of warning label beside our own supposed refinement. But the evidence has gradually pushed back against that caricature. Neanderthals were not stupid. They were not simply a rough draft. They were a successful human population adapted to challenging environments across Europe and Western Asia for a very long time. They lived through cold climates that would test anyone. They made tools. They hunted large animals. They controlled fire. They cared for members who had injuries or impairments severe enough that those individuals likely survived only through social support. Some evidence suggests symbolic behavior, ornament use in some contexts, and a sophistication that older stereotypes failed to grant them. Imagine a winter shelter in Ice Age Europe. Outside, wind moves over open land and carries a hard, clean cold. Inside, bodies cluster around warmth. Fur, smoke, stone, bone, and memory fill the space. Adults return from a dangerous hunt, not because they are reckless, but because the landscape demands cooperation. Children watch. Elders remember routes, seasons, animal habits. A community in such conditions cannot be simple. Survival there selects for judgment as much as strength. Neanderthals were powerfully built, likely in part because their bodies were adapted to retaining heat in cold regions. Their faces projected differently from ours. Their bodies carried a different balance of shape and muscle, but difference should not be confused with inferiority. They were suited to their worlds in ways that mattered deeply. And then we arrived. Homo sapiens spread out of Africa and entered regions where Neanderthals had lived for ages. For tens of thousands of years, the two lineages overlapped in parts of Western Asia and Europe. This overlap is one of the great charged encounters of prehistory because it forces us to ask a difficult question. What happens when two very similar human populations with partly shared capacities occupy related spaces? There are several possible answers, and the truth may include all of them. Sometimes they likely avoided one another. Sometimes they may have competed for prey, shelter, and routes. Sometimes they may have watched each other from a distance, unsure. And sometimes they definitely mixed, because many living people outside Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. That last point matters enormously. Neanderthals did not vanish in a perfectly clean sense. Part of them survives within us, not as a romantic fantasy, but as biology. Genes inherited from Neanderthals influence traits related to skin, immunity, and other bodily functions. This does not mean that Neanderthals still live as a separate people. It means that extinction, in their case, included absorption. Some Neanderthals were not replaced by us. Some were folded into the expanding sapiens population through interbreeding. That makes the old question harder, not easier. If mixing occurred, why did Neanderthals as a distinct population disappear? One answer may be numbers. Small populations are fragile. If one group is much larger, even modest mixing over time can gradually dissolve the smaller one as a separate population. This is sometimes called demographic swamping in broad idea. Imagine pouring a cup of dark dye into a lake. The dye does not vanish completely, but it no longer exists as its own clear shape. Its presence remains but diffused. Another answer may be climate instability. The late Pleistocene was not a calm age. Conditions shifted. Habitats opened and closed. Animal distributions changed. A population well adapted to one mosaic of environments could still be pressured if that mosaic changed too fast or too often. A third answer may be differences in social network size. Some researchers suggest that Homo sapiens maintained broader exchange networks, allowing resources, mates, ideas, and support to travel farther. If true, that would matter a great deal in bad times. A widely connected population can recover from local failure better than an isolated one. Think of two villages during repeated harsh winters. One has cousins and allies in distant valleys. The other mostly stands alone. Even if the second village is brave, skilled, and deeply knowledgeable, the first has a hidden advantage. It can borrow resilience from elsewhere. That hidden advantage may have mattered more than raw intelligence. We should also leave room for local violence or conflict without turning the whole story into a single war narrative. Human groups competing for land and prey do not need to wage total war for one group to pressure another. Repeated displacement, failed hunts, blocked routes, or simple fear can weaken already small populations. Even without dramatic massacres, one group can help make life harder for another. And then there is timing. Neanderthals did not disappear everywhere at once. Their extinction seems staggered. Some local populations likely died out before others. This suggests a patchwork ending, not a single moment. One region empties, another holds on. A refuge lasts a little longer. Then it too is gone. A family does not fall silent all at once. Room after room, the house dims. It is difficult not to feel melancholy here because Neanderthals were so close to us. Close enough to recognize. Close enough to imagine conversation. Close enough that, in another history, one might almost dream of them surviving in some mountainous corner into the dawn of civilization. But that did not happen. Around 40,000 years ago, give or take regional variation, Neanderthals as a distinct human population were gone. Not because they were absurd or animal-like, not because they lacked humanity. Perhaps because the world was changing, their numbers were small, our numbers were growing, and contact with us did not happen on equal terms. This is the third lesson of tonight's mystery. A species can be capable, social, adaptive, and deeply human, and still disappear when pressure comes from many directions at once. Neanderthals were not a joke at the edge of our story. They were a neighboring form of humanity, and when they vanished, the human world became quieter. 5. The ghost cousins of Denisova. Some vanished humans are known through skulls and skeletons. Some are known through almost a ghost. The Denisovans belong to that second category. For a long time, if you had asked what kinds of humans lived in ancient Asia, the answer would have leaned on familiar names and incomplete maps. Then a few scraps from Denisova cave in Siberia, especially a finger bone and later other fragments, opened a startling window. Genetic analysis revealed that these remains belonged to a distinct ancient human lineage, related to Neanderthals but not the same. This was one of the most dramatic moments in the study of human origins. because it showed that bones too fragmentary to impress a casual viewer could still transform the story. The Denisovans entered modern awareness not first through a full skeleton or a famous skull, but through DNA. Imagine the humility in that. A whole human lineage, hidden until recently, recognized not from some grand statue like fossil, but from tiny remains that modern science learned how to raid. And once the door opened, more strange connections appeared. Denisovan ancestry is present in some living populations today, especially in parts of Asia and Oceania, with notable contributions in populations connected to New Guinea and surrounding regions. A Denisovan-related genetic variant also appears to have helped Tibetans adapt to high altitude, which means that a vanished human lineage may still help living people breathe in thin mountain air. Pause on that for a moment. A people who no longer exist as a separate population may still whisper inside the blood of those now living on high plateaus. That is a beautiful and eerie kind of survival. What then were Denisovans like? The frustrating answer is that we still do not know as fully as we would like. Compared with Neanderthals, their physical record is sparse, though important finds such as a jaw from the Tibetan plateau and other evidence have expanded the picture. The wider pattern suggests they were not a tiny local curiosity. They likely ranged across large parts of Asia, perhaps existing in more than one regional form. Some evidence even hints that what we casually call Denisovans may have been internally diverse. In other words, the ghost may have been a crowd. Imagine ancient Asia with forests, mountains, open spaces, changing climates, and populations of archaic humans moving through it in patterns we only partly recover. Some groups meet Neanderthals, some meet Homo sapiens, some occupy high altitudes, some may survive in pockets longer than we once assumed. Their world is broad and our evidence is thin. That contrast creates a haunting effect. We know they mattered, yet we see them only in flashes. Why did they vanish? Again, there is no simple answer. Some Denisovan populations may have been absorbed into Homo sapiens through interbreeding. Others may have been outcompeted. Others may have been undone by climate shifts, isolation, or shrinking numbers. Because their geographic spread was large, their endings were likely not uniform. One mountain population may have lingered while another disappeared earlier. One group may have mixed heavily with incoming sapiens. Another may have stayed isolated and become vulnerable. Think of smoke seen through trees. You know there is a camp somewhere, but you cannot yet see the people clearly. That is what Denisovans are like in the record. Their influence is visible before their faces are. This matters deeply for our main question, because it weakens the idea that extinction must always mean direct replacement. The Denisovan story suggests something more fluid. Human lineages could meet, exchange genes, and still lose their distinct form over time. A lineage can vanish as a separate people while surviving in fragments inside another. That makes extinction less like a door slamming and more like a color fading into another color. It also reminds us that survival is not only about intelligence or physical strength. It is about network position in history. Who arrives when? Who is numerous? Who can move across which routes? Who can recover after local decline? Who can absorb whom and on what scale? If a Denisovan community on a high plateau met small numbers of sapiens, the result might differ from what happened in a lowland route carrying repeated waves of migration. Deep history was not one board game with a single rule. It was many local encounters, each with its own conditions. There is something almost literary in the Denisovan case. They are like a lost chapter found only through fingerprints on later pages. A lineage inferred by echoes. A vanished people whose existence was partly hidden inside ourselves until science became subtle enough to hear it. And the emotional effect is powerful. It tells us that the ancient world was even more populated, even more entangled than older stories allowed. We tend to imagine the past becoming clearer as we move backward to fundamentals, but here the opposite happens. The deeper we go, the more crowded the shadows become. The Denisovans teach another lesson. Not all disappearing humans left enough bone to hold in the hand. Some left a different kind of fossil, carried in living bodies. And that means the last surviving human species is not simply the species that won. It is also the species that gathered pieces of others as the old diversity narrowed. So when we ask why only we remain, the Denisovans whisper back with a complicated answer. Only we remain as a separate species, but not only us remain in every sense. The ancient crowd was reduced. It was also partly absorbed. In that way, extinction was sometimes less like annihilation and more like being slowly written into another story. 6. Island humans at the edge of the sea. If Neanderthals make us think of caves and ice, island humans make us think of scale. Small islands do strange things to life. On islands, large animals may become smaller. Small animals may become larger. Resources are limited. Predators may differ from those on mainlands. Travel is harder. Isolation is stronger. Evolution, given enough time, can produce forms that seem almost improbable. That is one reason discoveries such as Homo floresiensis in Indonesia caused such fascination. Here was a small-bodied human, sometimes nicknamed the Hobbit in popular language, living on the island of Flores. The fossils showed a combination of traits that led to intense discussion, but the basic fact was astonishing enough. A distinct small human population had survived on an island long after many would have assumed such diversity was impossible. Imagine their world: dense tropical growth, caves with cool interiors, limited resources compared with a vast continent, strange island animals, routes known intimately because on a small island knowledge of place becomes even more exact. You learn where water lingers, which paths save effort, which seasons pinch hardest, which risks cannot be afforded. An island can protect and trap at the same time. That double truth is important. Isolation may allow a distinct human lineage to survive longer than it otherwise would, because fewer competitors arrive and local adaptations settle into place. But the same isolation can become deadly if conditions change. A drought, a volcanic event, a prey collapse, or the arrival of newcomers can have bigger consequences when there is nowhere easy to expand. The story of Homo floresiensis seems to include this tension. Evidence suggests these humans lived on Flores for a long time, with fossil dates and tool evidence indicating deep residence. Their disappearance appears to have happened around the broad period when modern humans reached the region, though cause and timing remain subjects of study. Recent research has also explored environmental stress, including drying conditions, as a possible factor. Here again, we see the pattern of braided causes. If climate worsened, food webs shifted, and modern humans arrived in the same broad window, then extinction may not need one dramatic explanation. A population already living close to ecological limits can be pushed by several moderate pressures at once. Think of a small shop in a narrow lane. Business is never huge, but it works. Then the weather changes, supplies become uncertain, and a large competitor opens nearby. None of those alone might have ended the shop. Together, they might. Island populations are especially vulnerable to that kind of cumulative pressure. There is also Homo luzonensis from the Philippines, another reminder that island Southeast Asia held forms of humanity that do not fit neatly into the old model. The more fossils appear, the more the region looks like a mosaic of human experiments. Water barriers limited movement, but clearly not completely. Some humans crossed seas or were carried by chance. Once on islands, they adapted in distinctive ways. This does not mean island humans were fragile in spirit or incapable. On the contrary, to survive on an island for thousands upon thousands of years requires deep local skill. Knowledge must be precise. Waste is dangerous. Community memory matters. Every resource has weight, but ecological skill does not guarantee safety against sudden change. That may be one of the hardest truths in natural history. A people can know their world perfectly and still be endangered when the world itself shifts, or when an outside pressure enters that local wisdom was never built to handle. Imagine the last generations of an island human population. The forest sounds familiar. The caves are known. Paths remain where they always were, yet something is different. Perhaps prey becomes rarer. Perhaps shoreline patterns change. Perhaps strange newcomers appear occasionally on the edges of the known world. Perhaps the old confidence of place begins to thin. No one would call this the end. They would call it a difficult season, then another difficult season, then one more. Island stories teach us to take scale seriously. Extinction can happen faster where populations are small and options are few. Mainlands permit retreat, expansion, mixing and rescue from neighboring groups. Islands often do not. The island humans also correct our imagination. It is easy to think that by the late stages of human evolution, only large-brained, tall, familiar-looking humans remained relevant, but the islands say otherwise. The human family still included forms that would surprise us, each adapted to its own local circumstances. That variety did not vanish because it was absurd. It vanished because local specialization can become vulnerability when conditions change beyond the range a small population can absorb. This is why the story of vanished human species cannot be told only through intelligence. Intelligence is real, but ecology rules the stage. Bodies, climate, food webs, geography, and population size all shape what intelligence can actually save. On a generous mainland, a population may survive repeated shocks. On a small island, the same shocks can become final. So the island humans offer another quiet answer to our main question. Why did so many human species vanish except us? Because many lived in places where survival margins were narrow, numbers were low, and change could not be escaped. And why do we endure more often? Partly because our species kept moving, kept connecting, and kept spreading across many landscapes at once, which meant that a disaster in one place did not necessarily end the whole line. The islands are lovely and harsh teachers. They show that a human form can be brilliantly suited to one corner of the world. They also show how easily that corner can become a last refuge. 7. Sapiens enters a crowded world. Now we come to ourselves, not as heroes marching under bright music, but as one more human species entering an already occupied world. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, and the oldest widely accepted evidence for our species reaches back roughly 300,000 years. That is ancient by human standards, but compared with some older branches of the family, we were newcomers. By the time our species began expanding more widely beyond Africa, other human populations had already shaped Eurasia in deep and settled ways. So what made sapiens different? The safest answer is not one magical trait, but a bundle of advantages that reinforced one another. We were flexible. We were mobile. We were socially expansive. And perhaps most important, we became very good at connecting minds across distance. Imagine two groups facing a bad year. Both are intelligent. Both know their local landscape. Both can make tools and hunt. But one group is part of a larger web. It exchanges objects, mates, stories, warnings, and techniques across greater distances. It can carry not just food, but information. When prey patterns change in one valley, knowledge from another valley might matter. When local materials fail, Alternative methods may already be known. When a few adults die, alliance networks can soften the blow. This kind of distributed intelligence may have been one of the great hidden strengths of Homo sapiens. By distributed intelligence, I mean not just what one brain can do, but what many brains can do together when linked by language, memory, imitation, and trust. A single person is limited. A network is something else. Our species seems to have pushed that network effect hard. The archaeological record suggests growing complexity in tool traditions, symbolic behavior, ornament use, long-distance movement of materials in some times and places, and a widening ability to live in very different environments. We entered coasts, grasslands, forests, colder zones, and eventually deserts, highlands, and more. We were not always the best adapted local specialists at first contact, but we may have been unusually good generalists with strong social reach. And that combination is dangerous in history. A specialist can dominate one niche. A connected generalist can spread through many. Please notice that this is not the same as saying we were morally superior or naturally destined. It means only that certain traits helped our populations grow, recover, and expand. Evolution does not reward goodness. It rewards survival and reproduction under given conditions. One possible edge may have been innovation speed. In larger, more connected populations, useful behaviors can spread and accumulate faster. A tool improvement made in one place does not need to die with its inventor if ideas travel. Over long periods, even small differences in cumulative culture can matter greatly. Another possible edge may have been symbolic communication. Humans do not survive only by direct force. We survive by shared imagination. A mark can stand for an animal. A story can preserve a route. A ritual can bind strangers. A name can stabilize kinship. A symbol can carry memory further than a gesture alone. The richer the symbolic web, the larger and more stable social worlds can become. This would have mattered when moving into lands already occupied by other humans. To enter new territory repeatedly without fragmenting beyond recovery, a species benefits from portable identity. Not just bodies that can walk, but minds that can belong to communities larger than immediate sight. There may also have been life history differences. Some researchers have explored whether Homo sapiens had demographic advantages, such as higher fertility in some conditions or better survival of children due to broader support structures. These questions are complex and not fully settled, but the principle is clear. In the long run, modest advantages in population growth can transform the fate of species. A group that raises a few more surviving children each generation does not merely become slightly larger. Over thousands of years, it becomes historically overwhelming. Imagine two candles burning in separate rooms. One loses a tiny bit less wax each hour. For a long time, the difference seems trivial. Then one candle is still burning when the other is nearly gone. That is what small demographic advantages can do. We should also admit the force of movement itself. Homo sapiens did not stay contained. We kept pushing outward. Some movements failed. Some populations were lost. But enough succeeded that our species became geographically widespread. Geographic spread is a shield. It means no single drought, no local cold event, no regional prey collapse can erase the whole species at once. This may be one of the greatest contrasts between us and some vanished human populations. They were often more regionally bounded. We became more globally distributed. A species spread across many environments becomes harder to kill by accident. And yet, for all this, I want to keep the tone honest. We should not imagine that when sapiens met other humans, the result was a clean triumph of brilliance over backwardness. It was probably uneven, intimate, and often morally ambiguous. We mixed with some groups. We competed with others. We may have displaced, outnumbered, absorbed, and occasionally fought them. Our survival was not achieved by purity. It was achieved by expansion. Expansion changes everything. Once a species becomes numerous, connected, and geographically broad, it begins to alter the fate of neighboring species even without a single organized plan. It occupies routes. It pressures prey. It fills refuges. It makes local scarcity more likely for smaller populations. It absorbs individuals from those populations. It recovers from losses more easily. Over time, this can reduce diversity simply because one form becomes the default human presence nearly everywhere. That, perhaps, is what Homo sapiens slowly became. Not the only intelligent human, not the only toolmaker, not the only social one, but the one that built the widest web. This is a crucial answer to our central mystery. Many human species vanished except us because we did not survive only as local populations. We survived as an expanding network, and in a changing world, networks often outlast enclaves. 8. The power of shared memory. There is another part of the sapiens' advantage that deserves its own quiet room: culture that accumulates. All human groups had culture in some form. That should be said clearly. Neanderthals had learned traditions. Other archaic humans surely did too. No human population survives by instinct alone. But Homo sapiens may have reached a point where cultural accumulation became especially powerful, especially in larger linked populations. By accumulation, I mean this. A useful idea does not stay trapped in one mind or one generation. It is copied, improved, carried elsewhere, combined with other ideas, and made ordinary. Then new ideas are built on top of it. Over very long periods, this creates a kind of invisible tool chest much larger than any one person could invent alone. Think of a needle, a net, a trap design, a way to store food, a better stone blade, a story that remembers the stars, a ritual that keeps strangers cooperating, a habit of sharing shells or pigments that signals trust across distance. None of these by itself explains the fate of species. Together and passed on reliably, they create a world in which adaptation can move faster than genes alone. That is important in unstable climates. Genes change slowly. Culture can shift within a lifetime. If prey grows scarce, a population with flexible techniques can alter diet. If cold intensifies, clothing and shelter methods matter. If distance expands between groups, symbols and ritual can help keep exchange alive. If people move into coastal zones, knowledge of tides, shellfish, fish behavior, and boat-like movement along shore becomes part of survival. Our species seems especially good at turning experience into shareable systems. And once systems become portable, a species becomes more than the sum of its local adaptations. It can enter a new environment carrying a library inside memory and custom. Not a written library, not yet, but a living one. Songs, gestures, stories, habits, taboos, imitations, training, names for seasons, names for animals, instructions for children. This is one reason art, ornament, and symbolism matter even in a practical survival story. They are not always luxuries. Sometimes they are signs that minds are linking beyond immediate utility. A bead can be status, memory, group marker, gift, promise, identity. A painted wall can be story, ritual, teaching, or shared emotion. These things help groups remain groups, especially when stretched across time and distance. A stronger sense of shared identity may allow larger networks to function. Larger networks, in turn, preserve and spread knowledge. Preserved knowledge improves survival. Better survival supports larger populations, and larger populations give culture more minds in which to live. It becomes a loop, a very powerful loop. This may be one of the reasons Homo sapiens could enter so many environments without becoming fatally fragmented. We carried not just tools in our hands, but a growing common world in our heads. That common world helped strangers recognize one another as belonging to a broader human circle. It helped useful ideas travel. It helped children inherit more than immediate experience. No single discovery made us invincible, but cumulative culture may have made us hard to stop. And there is a melancholy side to this too. Once one human species reaches a strong cumulative advantage, neighboring species do not need to be inferior in every way to lose ground. They only need to be less able to scale, preserve, and transmit adaptation across wider networks. A local genius can be defeated by a broader library. A skilled valley can be overtaken by a continent of exchanging minds. So when we ask why only one human species remained, culture belongs near the center, not as decoration, but as infrastructure. The species that could most effectively pile learning on learning, then carry it across landscapes and generations, had a deep advantage in a world that kept changing. The old human crowd was made of many kinds of intelligence. Our species may have survived because it became especially good at making intelligence collective. 9. Climate as pressure, not villain. Climate does not usually speak in sentences, it speaks in pressure. A river runs lower, winter comes sharper, grassland shifts, forest retreats, ice expands then withdraws. Herd animals change their paths, coastlines move. A familiar route becomes useless, a trusted camp becomes exposed. A child born in one decade inherits a different map from the one an elder learned. This matters for every species, but especially for humans, because humans are both adaptable and dependent. We can change behavior faster than many animals, yet we still rely on water, food, shelter, migration routes, fuel, and social stability. When climate shifts, human life does not simply continue unchanged. It reorganizes, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The late Pleistocene, the broad age relevant to many of our vanished relatives, was full of climatic instability. Cold periods intensified, warmer intervals returned, landscapes reorganized repeatedly. In Europe and parts of Asia, populations had to deal not just with one environment, but with environments that kept changing. Now imagine what that means for small human populations. A large, widespread species can lose one region and survive elsewhere. A small regional population may not get a second chance. If its prey base collapses, if plant foods change, if mobility routes are blocked, if birth rates dip during a long, hard period, numbers may fall below recovery. This is one reason climate alone can be misleading as an explanation. It is not that a cold snap arrives and magically erases a species. It is that repeated environmental stress weakens resilience, and weakened populations become more vulnerable to everything else. Think of a person who has slept badly for weeks. The final cold they catch is not the whole story. It lands on a body already worn down. Extinction often works the same way. The visible final pressure is only the last weight on a structure already strained. For Neanderthals, climatic instability may have fragmented habitats and reshaped prey distributions. For island humans such as Homo floresiensis, changing rainfall and ecological stress may have reduced already limited options. For other archaic humans, the combination of harsh environments and small numbers may have thinned populations long before modern humans met them. Climate also affects contact between species. As landscapes open or close, migration corridors shift. Populations that were once separated may suddenly overlap. Competition may increase not because one species deliberately seeks a rival, but because both are funneled into the same livable zones. Imagine two households forced by flood or drought into the same smaller patch of usable land. Tension is no longer optional. Shared space creates pressure. That may have happened repeatedly in ancient human history. And yet climate pressure does not produce only conflict. It can also reward flexibility. A species able to switch diets, alter tools, use wider social support, or move quickly across long ranges may survive the same shock better than a species deeply tuned to one niche. This may be one reason Homo sapiens often appears more resilient in the long run. Our flexibility was not just physical, it was social and cultural. We could carry habits between environments, borrow new techniques, and build larger response systems. Still, it is important not to flatter ourselves too much. Our species also faced serious bottlenecks and dangers. There were likely times when Homo sapiens populations were frighteningly small. Some evidence suggests that the total number of breeding humans at certain points in our deep past may have been surprisingly limited. We also were vulnerable. We also could have failed. That shared vulnerability helps us see extinct relatives more clearly. They were not uniquely weak. They were participating in a dangerous age. Climate is especially brutal because it is impersonal. A rival group can be negotiated with, avoided, or resisted. A moving ecological baseline cannot. It does not hate you. It does not know you exist. It simply changes the terms of survival and waits to see who can keep up. There is a sad beauty in this. Whole styles of human life, perfectly workable under one set of conditions, may have become fragile under another. A body built for cold can still be challenged by fluctuating prey. A route learned through generations can become useless when water changes. An island adaptation can become a trap during drought. A local genius can become a local dead end if the local world itself disappears. That is why the question of extinction must remain gentle. We are not looking at failures of character. We are looking at mismatches between populations and changing conditions, sometimes worsened by outside pressures. If the weather of Earth had held steady forever, perhaps more human species would have lasted longer. If migration routes had stayed blocked, perhaps some never would have met. If rainfall patterns had not shifted, perhaps some island humans would have remained hidden still. History was not obligated to produce one surviving human species. It did so through moving conditions. Climate teaches another lesson. The disappearance of many human species was not only a story of one lineage beating others. It was also a story of worlds changing beneath everyone's feet. And in changing worlds, the winners are often not the strongest in the simple sense. They are the ones most able to remain many things at once. 10. Why numbers changed everything. Now let us talk about something less dramatic than fire, less romantic than art, and perhaps more decisive than either. Numbers. A species is not only what its members can do. It is also how many of them exist, how far apart they live, how easily they can find mates, how often children survive, and how quickly losses can be replaced. This sounds unpoetic, but deep history may turn on such quiet arithmetic. Imagine two human populations living in neighboring regions. Both make tools. Both understand their environment. Both tell stories and care for children. But one population has many scattered groups linked by exchange, while the other has fewer smaller groups living more locally. Now, imagine a series of hard years. The first population loses some communities, but stays connected overall. The second loses a few communities and becomes dangerously thin. From the outside, both still look human. From the inside, their futures have diverged sharply. Small populations face several hidden problems. Chance events matter more. If a storm, epidemic, injury cluster, or prey collapse hits a group of 50, the effect is proportionally much worse than if it hits a broader network of thousands. Genetic diversity can shrink. Finding mates may require risky movement. Cultural knowledge can disappear if too few elders remain. One unlucky sequence can begin a slide that is hard to reverse. This is why extinction can happen without anyone being obviously outclassed. A population can simply become too small to absorb normal bad luck. For Neanderthals, many researchers think numbers were often limited compared with expanding Homo sapiens populations. For isolated island humans, numbers were likely constrained by geography. For other archaic groups known only from fragments, sparsity itself may have been part of the problem from the start. Demography also interacts with interbreeding in powerful ways. If a small population mixes with a larger one over time, the smaller group may disappear as a distinct people even if many of its genes survive. This is not an extinction caused by battle alone. It is extinction by dilution within a bigger human sea. And then there is reproduction. Even a slight difference in average surviving offspring per generation can compound across millennia. A population with marginally better child survival, more stable food access for mothers, or broader kin support can gradually outgrow rivals without any dramatic confrontation. Think of two gardens planted the same day. One receives just a little more water and a little more shade at the right times. For weeks, the difference is hard to see. Months later, one garden is thick and self-renewing while the other is patchy and stressed. Species history can move on such margins. We should also remember that humans do not live as isolated pairs. Social structure affects numbers. Who shares food? Who helps raise children? Who travels for mates? Who can call on distant kin during scarcity? Who has customs that reduce internal fracture? Demography is social before it is merely statistical. In that sense, the question of why Homo sapiens remained may partly be the question of why our social organization scaled so well. We could become many without immediately breaking apart into permanently helpless fragments. Language, symbol, ritual, memory, and exchange may all have helped maintain that scaling. Once a population becomes large and wide enough, it gains a new kind of protection. Local disasters stop being species-level disasters. One region may fail while another thrives. Innovations can spread from one area to rescue another. Reproduction is buffered by redundancy. Redundancy sounds dull, but in survival it is a form of grace. Other human species may not have had enough of it. Picture a map at night. Tiny fires mark human camps. In one lineage, the fires are numerous and linked in long chains. In another, the fires are fewer, separated by harder distances. A harsh century blows through. Which map is more likely to remain lit? The answer is not always the more intelligent map. It is often the denser one. This is one reason scholars increasingly avoid simple stories about a single superior trait causing the disappearance of all other humans. A species may need no magical edge if it has enough demographic momentum. Once momentum builds, it changes every encounter. The more numerous species claims more territory, uses more resources, sends out more migrants, and has more chances for both competition and absorption. At that point, smaller neighboring populations may be doomed not by one dramatic defeat, but by arithmetic. One valley lost here, one lineage blended there, one island group cut off elsewhere, one harsh century too many. Extinction arrives quietly because numbers quietly fail. There is something almost modern in this. Empires, languages, businesses, and customs often survive not only because they are better in essence, but because scale gives them self-reinforcing power. What is large can endure damage that would kill what is small. What is connected can recover from local failure. What is numerous can absorb what is rare. Human species may have obeyed the same rule. So when we ask why only one human species remains, numbers deserve a seat near the center of the answer. We survived not just because individual sapiens were clever. We survived because enough sapiens existed across enough places for cleverness to compound instead of flicker out. The old crowd of humans may have vanished partly because many of its members lived beautifully but thinly. And thin survival in a restless world is never safe for long. 11. When extinction looked like mixing, one of the most moving parts of this story is also one of the most scientifically important. The extinct humans did not all leave us completely. Some live in us still. Neanderthal ancestry survives in many present-day people, especially outside Africa. Denisovan ancestry survives in some populations in Asia and Oceania, with different amounts in different groups. These are not tiny curiosities for specialists alone. They change the emotional shape of the whole question. Because if extinct humans contributed to our ancestry, then the phrase "only we survived" becomes both true and incomplete. True, because only Homo sapiens remains as a living human species. Incomplete, because Homo sapiens did not remain untouched. We are, in part, a meeting ground. Imagine several rivers coming together. After the meeting point, you may call the flow by one name, yet the waters within it have multiple origins. That seems a good way to think about our species after contact with other human lineages. The river is now called Homo sapiens, but some of its water came through Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other archaic humans not yet fully understood. This helps explain why extinction in the human family does not fit the image of a clean battlefield with one body left standing. Sometimes it looked like replacement. Sometimes like local disappearance. Sometimes like slow absorption. Sometimes like all three at once in different places. Why does mixing matter so much? Because it shows that the boundary between us and other humans was permeable. We were not separated by an impossible wall. Encounters could become intimacy. Children could be born. Genes could move between populations. Culture may also have moved, though that is harder to prove. This means that some vanished human species may have ended partly because they were biologically and socially close enough to be absorbed by a growing sapiens world. That is a strange kind of extinction. Not destruction alone, but dissolution of distinctness. Think of a small regional dialect entering a much larger language community. Over time, the dialect as a separate speech form weakens. Yet some of its words, rhythms, and sounds survive inside the bigger language. Something has been lost, but not everything. That seems close to what happened with some human lineages. It also explains why the surviving traces are uneven. Modern people do not all carry the same archaic ancestry in the same amounts, because ancient meetings happened in particular times and places. A population moving through one corridor met one set of cousins. Another population moving elsewhere met different ones or none at all. History shaped our bodies before writing ever began. There is a lesson here about identity. We often like clean categories. Pure this, pure that. Deep history laughs gently at those desires. Human beings were meeting, moving, and mixing long before anyone invented modern ideas about fixed identity. The species that survived globally was not a sealed vessel. It was a traveling, changing one. This has practical meaning too. Some archaic genes may have helped modern humans adapt to local conditions, including immunity and high-altitude survival in some populations. In that sense, mixing was not merely accidental background. It may have been useful. So why did separate species vanish if mixing could happen? Because mixing does not preserve a smaller population as a separate entity unless conditions keep it distinct. If a larger and expanding species keeps absorbing individuals from a smaller one, while the smaller population also loses territory and numbers, the long-term result is usually not coexistence forever. It is the fading of one identity into another. There is tenderness in that and sadness too. Imagine meeting a cousin people. They look different but not impossibly different. They have their own songs, habits, myths, body language, knowledge of land. Over generations, marriages happen. Camps merge. The children speak more like one side than the other. The old local style becomes rarer. Within 1,000 years, the distinct people are gone, though some of their blood and some of their wisdom remain. From inside history, this might not even feel like extinction at first. It might feel like blending. Only later, from a great distance, would we realize that a whole branch of humanity had ceased to exist on its own. This changes the moral tone of the story. The end of human diversity was not always a scene of open cruelty. Sometimes it may have been intimacy under unequal conditions. A small people does not need to be hated to disappear. It only needs to be outnumbered, outspread, and slowly folded into a larger human flow. That is perhaps why the ancient world feels so close and so haunting. Its endings are not always spectacular. They are recognizably human. Contact, alliance, attraction, migration, pressure, imbalance. The same forces that create families can also erase distinct peoples. So here is another answer to our question. Many human species vanished except us because we were not only replacing them, we were also becoming a larger vessel into which some of them were poured. And that means the last surviving human species carries, in quiet measure, the memory of those who no longer stand beside us. 12. Conflict without a final war. When people hear that several human species overlapped, the imagination quickly jumps to battle. It is an understandable leap. Humans compete. Humans defend territory. Humans fear outsiders. Surely then, one part of the answer must be war, perhaps, but we should be careful. Violence may have mattered in some places and times. Yet the evidence does not support a simple movie version in which Homo sapiens marched across continents, wiping out every other human species in clean campaigns. The deeper story is less theatrical and in some ways more believable. Competition can damage a population without full-scale war. If two human groups hunt similar prey, use similar shelters, and depend on similar water sources, then even peaceful overlap can create pressure. One group arriving in larger numbers may reduce available resources for the other. One group's broader social network may allow it to hold territory more steadily. One group's greater mobility may push the other into less favorable land. No spear thrown in anger is required for this to matter. Imagine a market town where a larger merchant network arrives. The old local shops are not burned overnight, yet slowly they lose access, lose customers, lose suppliers, lose confidence. A few close, others combine. Eventually the town feels different. Competition can erase without spectacle. The same may be true in prehistoric landscapes. Still, we should not become naive. Some encounters between human groups were surely violent. Hunting territories are serious matters. Fear of strangers is ancient. Misread intentions can escalate quickly, especially where languages, gestures, or customs differ. A small population facing repeated harassment or forced movement may decline rapidly. But even here, the picture is likely local and patchy. One valley may have seen avoidance, another trade or imitation, another marriages, another raiding, another long-distance non-contact. Deep history is not one event repeated everywhere. It is many local human dramas unfolding under different ecological conditions. There is also a subtler point. If Homo sapiens had wider alliance systems, better long-distance coordination, or stronger demographic recovery after conflict, then even low-level violence would hit neighboring species asymmetrically. The same loss hurts a small, thin population far more than a large, connected one. In that sense, violence may have mattered not because we were uniquely savage, but because scale turns ordinary conflict into uneven consequence. Think again of those maps of nighttime fires. If one lineage has many linked fires and the other only a few isolated ones, then a single raid, a failed season, or the death of a few adults means very different things to each. Conflict is multiplied by demography. And then there is fear itself. A population under pressure becomes less efficient even before open violence. Routes are abandoned. Risky but necessary hunts are postponed. Sleep worsens. Children are kept closer. Mobility changes. Anxiety becomes ecological. Human beings do not need constant battle to be damaged by the possibility of battle. That kind of chronic pressure may have shaped some interactions between sapiens and other humans. Yet I think it is important, especially in a sleep history story like this, not to let violence swallow all other explanations. People love sharp stories. One group kills another. Mystery solved. But reality is usually heavier and slower. Extinction most often comes through accumulation. Violence may be one weight among others, not the entire machine. This matters morally as well. If we tell ourselves that the last human species survived simply because it was the most ruthless, we risk misunderstanding both the past and the present. Ruthlessness can help in local moments, but long survival usually rests on broader factors: adaptability, numbers, networks, child survival, mobility, and luck. The truth may be more uncomfortable than simple brutality. We may have survived because ordinary human expansion, carrying all the usual mix of cooperation, mating, rivalry, imitation, fear, and occasional violence, was enough to reduce neighboring species over time. In other words, the disappearance of other humans may not require monsters. It may require only humans being human under unequal conditions. That thought lingers, because it means that the end of human diversity was not necessarily driven by some grand evil uniquely foreign to us. It may have emerged from familiar behaviors scaled across millennia: protecting kin, seeking resources, moving into new land, preferring allies, distrusting strangers, taking opportunities, recovering better than others after loss. This is how history often changes shape, not through endless dramatic battles, but through repeated ordinary pressures that eventually become irreversible. So yes, violence may have played a role, but perhaps not as the main hero of the explanation, rather as one note in a larger, darker chord. And the chord as a whole says this: when more than one kind of human shares a changing world, even ordinary competition can become fatal for the smaller branch. 13. Luck and the narrow margin. After all the talk of skill, climate, networks, and numbers, we should make room for one more force: luck. History is full of people who mistake survival for proof of superior virtue. Deep time warns us against that mistake. Sometimes survival means competence. Sometimes it means scale. Sometimes it means adaptability. And sometimes it also means that certain disasters happen to someone else instead of you. A drought does not arrive everywhere equally. A volcano does not cover every path. A disease does not strike every valley the same way. A shoreline does not retreat kindly for all. An unlucky sequence of bad years can break one population while another, not far away, holds on. This is especially true for small, isolated, or specialized groups. When numbers are low, luck becomes structural. A few deaths in childbirth, a failed migration, the loss of a good hunting season, a broken alliance, one severe storm, one prey collapse, and history tilts. We know this pattern from many species. The last mammoths on isolated islands, for example, survived long after mainland populations vanished, then disappeared due to a final chain of pressures. The same principle likely touched human populations too. Once a lineage becomes rare and localized, chance events matter more and more. Imagine a tiny community in a mountain refuge. They know the terrain. They have lasted through centuries others did not. They are not foolish. They are not weak. They are, in their own local way, extraordinarily resilient. But resilience is not magic. If 2 children die one winter, if a key elder is lost, if a mating exchange fails, if game shifts farther than expected, the margin narrows. Then one more bad year comes. That final year may look like the cause. Really, it is the last move in a long, narrowing game. Luck also matters at the species level. Homo sapiens may have possessed real advantages, but our path was not smooth. There may have been times when our own species came frighteningly close to failure. If a migration corridor had closed sooner, if certain populations had not found coasts or river routes, if particular alliances had not formed, our story could have thinned before it widened. This is not false modesty. It is a fair reading of how contingent history often is. The world did not owe Homo sapiens survival. It happened, but it did not have to happen. That recognition should soften any triumphal tone. The fact that we are the last surviving human species does not prove we were destined from the start. It proves only that, across many encounters and many climate turns, our line managed to remain large, flexible, connected, and fortunate often enough. Fortunate often enough. That may be one of the most honest phrases in the whole story. There is another reason luck matters. It helps explain why extinction can look uneven and strange in the record. One species may persist unexpectedly long in a refuge. Another may vanish surprisingly early. One region may show overlap between lineages. Another may not. Randomness, filtered through geography and ecology, creates patchy maps. That patchiness can frustrate people who want one clean rule. But perhaps the patchiness is the rule. Human extinction was not one machine operating the same way everywhere. It was many local stories, all leaning in the same long direction. Luck, of course, is not completely separate from other factors. A widespread connected species is luckier in practice because it has more chances to survive shocks. A tiny, isolated group is unluckier because chance hits harder. So luck is partly built from structure. Still, chance remains real. The exact order of events matters. A people can survive one drought and fail in the next. One group can miss a disaster by a season. One path can remain open a little longer. One child can live and later become the ancestor of many. History often turns on lives no larger than that. In the end, luck is not a satisfying explanation if taken alone. But it is a necessary one if we want to be honest. Not every vanished human lineage lost because it lacked some essential quality. Some may have been overtaken by a stack of unfavorable events from which there was no recovery. This is the final scientific lesson before our closing reflection. Why did so many human species vanish except us? Because survival is never one thing. It is adaptation, yes, and numbers, and networks, and climate response, and interbreeding, and competition, and geography. And then, laid over all of it like weather over a landscape, luck. The last human species standing is still standing partly because enough pieces kept falling our way. 14. The missing pages of humanity before we close completely. There is one more mystery worth leaving beside the fire. We do not know everything. This may sound obvious, but in a story like this, it matters deeply. The vanished humans are known through incomplete evidence. Fossils are rare. Ancient DNA survives only in special conditions. Caves preserve some lives and erase others. Tropical heat destroys much. Rising seas have swallowed old coastlines where humans surely lived. Whole regions remain underexplored. Many bones lie in ground that has not yet been searched, or will never preserve them well enough to find. So the human family tree we use today is almost certainly not the final version. There may have been more populations, more meetings, more branchings, and more survivals in hidden refuges than we currently know. This uncertainty does not weaken the story. It gives it depth. Imagine reading a damaged old book where many pages are missing. You still understand the plot, but you also know there were scenes you never saw, characters who entered and left in silence, motives half erased by time. That is how deep human history reaches us. Not whole, but torn. Not silent, but interrupted. The Denisovans already taught us this lesson once. For years, an entire human lineage lived outside the common picture until genetics brought it into view. Future discoveries may do the same again. A jaw, a tooth, a cave layer, a genome from sediment, and suddenly the map changes. The ancient world becomes more crowded, not less. That possibility should make us cautious about overconfidence. Perhaps some species we treat as separate will one day be folded into broader populations. Perhaps some broad populations will be split into several lineages. Perhaps some region we think was empty of archaic humans will prove otherwise. The story remains alive because the evidence keeps growing, and there is something lovely in that. The vanished humans are not fully gone from knowledge. They keep returning in fragments, asking us to revise the story and become less arrogant. Each discovery says, in its own quiet way, you thought you knew what humanity was, but the past was wider than that. Even our central question may shift with time. Why did so many human species vanish except us? Future evidence may force us to ask instead, how many really vanished without leaving descendants at all, and how many were braided into us so deeply that the old categories become less certain? Science has not ended the mystery. It has made the mystery better. That is why this subject holds the mind so gently. It gives answers, yes, but not the final cold kind. It leaves room for wonder. It lets us admit that our species lives at the edge of a partially known family archive. Somewhere in caves, in ancient mud, in forgotten sediments, more cousins may still be waiting to be found. And if they are found, they will not make us less human. They will remind us that humanity was larger, stranger, and more shared than we once believed. 15. The last human crowd, so now the fires have burned low, and we can return to the hill where we began. Imagine again that ancient earth at dusk, but this time let the whole story gather in one view. Across Africa, Europe, and Asia, different humans move through their own known worlds. Homo erectus, enduring across vast ages. Neanderthals in cold country, strong and skilled. Denisovan populations spread through Asia, leaving more trace in genes than in bone. Island humans living in small local ecologies that shape them into distinctive forms. Other branches, debated, half seen, poorly named, perhaps still hidden from us in rock and soil. For a long time, the Earth was not waiting for one final species to arrive and claim it. It was hosting a conversation among many human possibilities. Then the conversation narrowed. Some lineages ended because they were few, some because climates changed too quickly, some because isolation protected them until it trapped them, some because our species arrived in growing numbers and made old landscapes harder to share, some because they mixed with us and lost their separate form, some because luck ran against them. And we remained. But notice what kind of victory this really is. Not the clean victory of a perfect species proving its worth. Not a neat ladder with nature smiling at the top rung. What remains is a more sobering picture. One lineage became widespread, connected, numerous, flexible, and fortunate enough to outlast the others. In doing so, it did not preserve the old human diversity. It replaced part of it, absorbed part of it, and inherited part of it. That lineage is us. There is pride available in that story, but only a careful kind. We are capable of extraordinary adaptation. We can share knowledge across distance, reshape environments, carry memory in symbols, and survive in many climates. Those are real strengths, yet there should also be humility. Because the extinct humans were not ridiculous creatures put here to fail. They were alternatives. They were neighbors in time. They were the proof that being human once meant more than one body plan, more than one adaptation, more than one style of life. Their disappearance makes our world lonelier than the old one, and perhaps it also makes our responsibilities heavier. We are the only human species left. There is no other branch nearby to remind us what plurality once looked like. We carry the entire living human experiment by ourselves. In some ways, that gives us power. In other ways, it should give us caution. A family with many branches can lose one and still remain various. A family with one branch left has no such comfort. Maybe that is one of the deeper reasons these vanished cousins fascinate us so much. They make us feel both less special and more fragile. Less special because we were never the only possible humans. More fragile because survival is clearly not guaranteed forever. If enough pressures can erase human lineages that lasted hundreds of thousands of years, then permanence is not a promise written anywhere. And yet there is comfort too. Because the story does not end in total emptiness. The others are gone as separate peoples, but not always entirely gone. Some of them remain in our genes. Some remain in our inherited adaptations. All remain in the widened understanding of what humanity once was. Every fossil, every cave layer, every ancient genome enlarges the room we live in mentally. It reminds us that to be human is to come from a crowd. Even if only one voice is left singing, the harmony once existed. So when you hear the title of tonight's mystery, why so many human species vanished except us, the answer is no longer one sentence. They vanished for many reasons braided together. Because the world changed, because numbers mattered, because networks mattered, because some were isolated, because some were absorbed. Because competition pressed on the small, because luck was uneven, and because our own species became the broadest moving web in the ancient world. That is the answer science can offer for now. But there is also a quieter answer, one that belongs to reflection rather than research. Perhaps they vanished to teach us that humanity was never a single obvious thing. It was once a field of possibilities. We are not the only form that could walk upright, make tools, use fire, cross distance, care for kin, or meet the night with thought. We are simply the last one left doing it. And maybe, as sleep comes and the old world grows dim, that is the thought worth keeping. Not that we won, but that we come from a lost multitude, and the earth was once full of more human voices than one.